Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Research in the Time of COVID panel, which is part of UCLA's Undergraduate Research Week. We're so happy that you were able to join us today. I'm Dr. Jacqueline Artem. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Undergraduate Research Center for the Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. And we have a busy week full of tons of events for Research Week. And we're so glad that you have come to one of our featured events on our first day of Research Week. So the event you're at today is the Research in the Time of COVID panel, and we're going to be hearing about research of 4 of our outstanding undergraduate researchers who come from across UCLA's campus. So 3 of 4 of our researchers are doing projects that are directly related to the COVID pandemic, and all 4 of them are going to give brief presentations about the research that they've been engaged in this year. We're then going to have a little bit more of an informal conversation. And each of the students will get a chance to talk a little bit more casually about their experiences during research during the pandemic, what some challenges were, or perhaps what silver linings they found. And I'm going to go ahead and moderate that roundtable discussion. And then at the very end of the panel, we'll have about 10-15 minutes for questions from the audience. So if you've got questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Probably chat is easiest, and I'll go ahead and keep my eye on those, and you'll be able to ask questions of our fantastic panelists at the end. So don't be shy at the end. So right now, what I'm going to do is take a few moments and introduce each of our panelists individually, and then they will go one by one and share their research presentations. So our first presenter is Alec Simoni from Granada Hills. He is a psychobiology major doing a minor in classical civilization. His research project is titled Operational Changes in the UCLA Westwood Clinical and Translational Research Center during the COVID-19 pandemic, and he has been working on his research with Dr. Noah Fetterman. Alexia Joseph is our second presenter. She is from Orlando, Florida. Her major is molecular cell and developmental biology. She is part of the Undergraduate Research Scholars Program, and her project is titled The Effect of Reprimo on Sex Differences of Energy Homeostasis. Her faculty mentor is Dr. Stephanie Correa. Our third presenter is Brendan Munro Thompson, who is a World Arts and Cultures major and has minors in visual and performing arts education and community engagement and social change. He is a transfer student from the San Fernando Valley. His research project is titled The Work of Alternative Art Spaces and Arts Activism During the Pandemic, and his faculty mentor is Dr. David Geer. Jailah Johnson is a Sociology and African American Studies double major with a minor in public health. Her research project is titled Lack of Access, Distrust, or Both, a closer look at the Black community's relationship with the US healthcare system and their attitudes towards seeking the COVID-19 vaccine. And her faculty mentor is Dr. Sherry Larkins. So I think we're going to go ahead and just get started. So Alec, do you want to share your screen and share your presentation with us?
Sure thing. So good afternoon, everyone. My presentation is focusing on the operational changes in the UCLA Westwood Clinical and Translational Research Center during the COVID-19 pandemic. So a little bit of background, the UCLA Clinical and Translational Research Center, also known as the CTRC, supports and supervises human clinical trials in all therapeutic areas and within all age groups. This includes phase 1 clinical trials. It's located in the lower level of the UCLA Center for Health Sciences in Westwood, California, and is fully staffed with nurses, nurse practitioners, and phlebotomists. It was also the host of the AstraZeneca vaccine trials in-house. As you can see from some pictures of the CTRC, it looks a lot like a hospital. However, it has that extra added responsibility of also conducting clinical research. So the aim of my study was to determine why and how the UCLA CTRC changed its operational guidelines and infrastructure to accommodate COVID-19 clinical research studies. What were some of the actions taken by the UCLA CTRC to allow the continuation of clinical research during the COVID-19 pandemic? And by studying the CTRC, what can we find out for future clinical research centers to do in future pandemics? Some study design and methods. The study team conducted extensive Zoom interviews with CTRC staff and directors on operational changes made to the site. And we also analyzed published research from the DGSOM Dean's report and examined new infrastructure built on site. So let's get into some results. So the biggest result was a decrease in study activation time. Now, typically when clinical research trials or studies are getting onboarded, they have to go through this entire activation process, which is very arduous and bureaucratic. There's a lot of red tape. But the biggest change is that study activation time decreased sharply during the early days of the pandemic, which allowed COVID-19 related research studies to begin much sooner. This went from a typical study activation time of 87 days before the pandemic down to 26 days. So this allowed things to really just get off the board much quicker. Secondly, the addition of pods, aka outdoor mobile treatment pods, were constructed to separate suspected COVID-19 positive patients from healthy patients. This drastically reduced viral transmission within the CTRC. Patients within the CTRC are either immunocompromised or have one or more comorbidities. So it's incredibly important to make sure that the virus didn't spread around the patient population. Additionally, a buddy system was established for all CTRC personnel, requiring at least 2 staff members to occupy the pod at any given time for added support. So as you can see, they're completely isolated enclosures. Patients would go in there, get evaluated by the doctors, nurses, and that's it. It would be completely separated from the rest of the research ward. Secondly, there was an increase in organizational efficiency. So when it comes to healthcare delivery, we typically think of doctors and nurses entering the patient's room to deliver care. But for the phase 3 AstraZeneca vaccine trials, this interaction was flipped, with healthy COVID-negative patients at the CTRC visiting multiple rooms, each containing their own healthcare provider, each tasked with a varying assignment. So this resulted in an increase in efficiency, which decreased vaccine delivery times as a result. The AstraZeneca trial administered approximately 280 vaccines in 90 days, with around 140 people getting 2 doses each. And the vaccination process is described below, with a check-in at the front desk lasting about 5 minutes, study consent by a nurse practitioner taking around 30 minutes, which was the longest amount of time spent in that kind of blocking. And then a medical history that took 15 minutes, blood draw and vitals, another 15. And lastly, the infusion room, which was pictured here for vaccine delivery, which took 15 minutes. Thirdly was the establishment of the Scientific Prioritization and Feasibility Committee. So the amount of COVID-19 related studies as a result of the pandemic was so great that a separate ethical committee had to be created to evaluate these types of studies exclusively. These ethical committees are always meant to make sure that new research studies are ethically and kind of logistically feasible, and just to make sure that no guidelines are being violated. They're composed of a variety of healthcare professionals ranging from doctors, nurses, to lab and data analysts. The SPFC evaluated 234 studies since its establishment and allowed 217 to continue past their review. Lastly, nurse practitioners and new operational guidelines were established. So 2 new nurse practitioners were hired during the pandemic, and their purpose were to place orders such as blood draws, drugs, EKGs in the patient electronic medical record, conduct physical exams on patients, facilitate the consenting process for both COVID and non-COVID studies, and train registered nurses in new procedures. Before COVID, the CTRC had no NPs, and this left doctors conducting studies in the CTRC to put in their own orders. And as those who work in healthcare know, placing orders is an often tedious and long process, which only increased responsibilities of doctors as they ran their own studies and dealt with their patient hospitalizations, etc. Pictured here is a nurse inputting some patient information into the electronic medical record. And all in all, this is just kind of alleviating the weight placed on doctor shoulders as they were running around the CTRC. Some next steps: further research must be done evaluating the efficacy of the operational measures and guidelines implemented at the CTRC. And we want to look at how many different staff members contracted COVID-19 during the pandemic. Acknowledgements: we'd like to acknowledge Dr. Arash Naeem, Dr. Noah Fetterman, Unit Director Marjorie Wyman, CTRC Administrative Manager Amanda Gonzalez, and the entire staff of the CTRC for their time and support on this project. A special thank you to Dr. Lori Shager-Irwin and Dr. Pamela Davidson for their mentorship and guidance. And a final thank you to the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, the Research Associates Program, which I'm a part of, for giving us the opportunity to pursue and present this research. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Alec. Okay, we are going to move right along. So next we are going to hear from Alexia. Alexia, do you want to share your screen with us?
Yes. Okay. Let me just set up my laser pointer if I can. Okay, hi everyone. As Jacqueline introduced earlier, my name is Alexia Joseph, and I'm a molecular cell and developmental biology student here at UCLA. And my research is not focused on COVID, but I think I could add relevance to kind of speaking to molecular biology in the time of COVID. And my specific project is on the role of reprimo expressing neurons in altering heat generation. So I got interested in studying this particular topic because I took this one class called Sex from Biology to Gendered Society my entire freshman year. And within it, I learned about sex hormones and disease, and I became interested in studying how varying hormone levels mediate different physiological effects. So namely, what I study is this withdrawal of estrogen at menopause because it leads to decreases in energy expenditure. So I focus on the hypothalamus, more specifically, this one region known as the ventrometal hypothalamus, or VMH, because it's known to be involved in thermoregulation. And the VMH is also interesting because there's a lot of estrogen receptor alpha within it. So studies have shown that estrogen receptor alpha signaling could mediate brown adipose tissue thermogenesis. And brown adipose tissue is the significant site of heat generation in mammals, and it's very rich in mitochondria. So studies implied that knocking out ER alpha in the VMH had an effect on brown adipose tissue thermogenesis, but it wasn't clear what population of neurons was responsible for regulating this. So this led us to two major problems. One is that though there's this consensus that the VMH mediates brown adipose tissue thermogenesis through estrogen receptor alpha, it's not known what specific neuron population mediates this. Another is that we don't really know the genes that contribute to these decreases in energy expenditure we see following menopause. So to address this, I'm going to focus on using techniques that to understand the function of one specific subpopulation of neurons in the VMH. And so we recently identified the subpopulation of estrogen responsive neurons in this region. And we found that these neurons actually show a stronger expression of this gene reprimo in females than in males. So as you can see in this one image here of a female brain, we see that reprimo and ER alpha are highly expressed in this region. To kind of understand the role further, we administered small interfering siRNA, which is a transient knockdown, to knock down temporarily expression of the gene reprimo. And we actually found that it regulates core temperature in a sex-specific fashion. So as you can see in males here, we don't see that administering the siRNA had any significant difference in body or core temperature. But in females, we see that administering the siRNA targeting reprimo showed a significant increase in interscapular temperature. And this kind of suggested that reprimo is responsible for regulating core temperature in a sex-specific fashion. Because the data insinuates that the gene reprimo is involved in regulating thermogenesis, we were curious to understand whether these neurons that express reprimo in the VMH had an effect on brown adipose tissue thermogenesis, leading me to my current hypothesis that reprimo expressing neurons mediate a difference in core body temperature by driving brown adipose tissue thermogenesis. So to start designing experiments to study the effect of reprimo and reprimo expressing neurons in the VMH, we generated this mouse known as the reprimo Cree FRT mouse. And this mouse was designed to link expression of the gene reprimo to Cree, or also iCree here stands for the codon improved Cree recombinase. Because of this construct, Cree will only be expressed in cells expressing reprimo, and with Cree present, we can use different Cree-dependent viruses or techniques to alter neuronal activity with in a spatially and molecularly specific manner. So in this study, I used Cree-dependent designer receptors exclusively activated by designer drugs, also known as DREADs, and then a ligand, clozapine and oxide, to activate the neurons that express Cree, which in these cases are the reprimo expressing neurons that I touched on earlier. So we wanted to understand, how do these reprimo expressing neurons regulate thermogenesis? So we used this DREAD system, and we used CNO to activate the neurons, and we used saline as a control, and we actually delivered these injections in a counterbalance design. And we predicted that activating these neurons will actually increase brown adipose tissue temperature, and we could further understand brown adipose tissue thermogenesis. As you can see here, there's an image, and you can kind of see what that looks like on an infrared image of the mice. So as I said before, we injected mice with CNO or saline, and obviously our sample size is kind of small, but we were excited because following almost immediately after injection in these female mice, we see that there's an increase in brown adipose tissue temperature, even though we have an N of 4 in this group. And in our one control mouse, we're not really seeing the same trend. But obviously this data is preliminary, so we're currently performing more surgeries to increase our sample size. And we also want to perform the same experiment in males to understand if these neurons are regulating brown adipose tissue temperature in a sex-specific manner. Long term, we hope to use this knowledge to develop techniques to address decreases in energy expenditure and overall gain insight onto how it is that estrogen alters energy expenditure. I'd like to thank all these grants here for funding the research. I would especially like to thank the Silva Endowment and Smith Endowment for funding my participation in the Undergraduate Research Scholars Program. Additionally, I'd like to give a special thanks to my mentors, Dr. Stephanie Correa and Norma Sandoval, along with other members of the lab for their assistance in completing this project.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Let's see, I think we're going to move right along to Brendan, who is our next presenter. Brendan, do you want to share your screen with us?
All right, can you see that okay? Sweet. Okay, so my presentation is about alternative art spaces in arts activism. A little bit about myself. I am Brendan Munro Thompson. I use he, they pronouns. I'm in the World Arts and Cultures Department, supervised by faculty mentor David Geer, and my project is the work of alternative art spaces and arts activism during the pandemic. So a little bit about why I got interested in this research. I helped with an art space called New2 for several years before it closed during the pandemic. And so this led me to this idea that alternative art spaces are at risk. And an alternative art space is basically outside of the museum and the white wall galleries. They are pretty much self-funded. Sometimes they'll go for government or otherwise grants. But basically they're on their own. And because of the pandemic, there's so much at risk. As I said before, New2 Community Gallery, which I worked at for many years, for several years, closed during the pandemic for a myriad of reasons, but the pandemic was one of them. And so I also want to start an art space of my own. And so I wanted to get a better insight into what these spaces are doing, how they're surviving, and what are some of their next steps. So my research question is, how has the pandemic affected alternative art spaces and how have they engaged with arts activism through this period of civil unrest? And for my methodology, I used ethnographic methods. So I reached out to these spaces via email and set up Zoom interviews. Basically, I did some semi-conversational interviews with 6 spaces, each for 30 to 45 minutes with 9 questions. I recorded each interview and took some quick notes on the side. And most of these spaces are based out of LA, with 2 that are not. The LA spaces include Junior High Los Angeles, Naval LA, Los Angeles Poverty Department, and the 4th one was, I'm blanking for a second. Well, the out-of-state ones were Public Space 1 in Iowa City and Meow Wolf Workers Collective, which was an unofficial interview with a couple of workers from the union at Meow Wolf. The 4th LA space was Junior High, Naval, Los Angeles Poverty Department. I'm blanking on it right now for some reason, but oh, it was New2. That's why I blanked on it, because I interviewed the former gallery director and the one who started the gallery, just to get insight into the beginnings of New2 and why it closed. And already at conclusions, these are some things that I drew upon from my research. Just generally from interview 1, I asked a lot about do-it-yourself culture, which, as related to the arts and art spaces, is basically about, not contracting out the work, doing it yourself, painting the walls, spackling, whatever it takes. to do it yourself. And so I learned from this research that a lot of people unprompted said that doing it together is more important than doing it yourself. Having a team, a community to do it together with is really important. And so that became a central point in my research. I asked what it takes to start an art space, and almost universally they said money is important to start, but community is essential to thrive. Of course, you have to pay rent at the end of the day or at the beginning of each month, but community is what makes each art space really work. And so with starting my own art space, I want to keep that in mind and, cultivate a community that is creative and together, and just everything that's really important to putting that together. Another point from my research is that the pandemic hit Los Angeles a lot harder than other areas. At Public Space One in Iowa City, they were able to continue hosting their artist studios. Public Space One has 2 houses in Iowa City that they operate out of, and so they were able to continue with their 4 artist studios that basically ran independently from each other and didn't have crossover, so that COVID wasn't a concern for them. Finally, arts activism came up in different ways for each space. A lot of them said that arts activism, along with DIY culture, was everything to them. And so you see a lot of these spaces supporting Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, and other social justice concerns. And then my last point was that with starting a space, you want to work hard, but don't burn out. It's so easy to do it all yourself. Like I said, doing it together is more important. So burning out happens to a lot of people because they don't delegate the work or they work too hard. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that you don't want to burn out and you don't want the space ultimately to end because not everyone's on the same page and everyone's just burnt out. And so for some acknowledgements, I just wanted to thank my faculty mentor, David Geer, the AAP program, and Arushi Singh with my Arts Initiative cohort, without which this wouldn't have been possible, and thanking all the spaces that allowed me to interview them and get more insight into the world of art spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. That was wonderful. Okay, last but not least, we've got Jailah. Jailah, do you want to share your screen with us?
Yes, I'll go ahead and do that. Alrighty. Can y'all see everything okay? Just to make sure y'all don't see any speaker notes, anything like that, right?
Yeah, looks good, Jailah.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty, so let me rearrange this really quickly. Alrighty, so hello everyone. My name is Jailah Johnson, and as stated before, my project title is Lack of Access, Distrust, or Both, a closer look at the Black community's relationship with the US healthcare system and their attitudes towards seeking the COVID-19 vaccine. So my interest in my topic originated from the onset of the pandemic, honestly. Given the current conversation surrounding the vaccine rollout, I wanted to specifically explore how distrust for the healthcare medical system and lack of access both contribute to COVID-19 vaccination trends in the Black African-American community. So that's where I got my research question from. So a little bit about the historical significance and background of the topic itself. Historically, the US medical system has exploited the Black community for medical experimentation purposes for years. These events have created a dynamic of distrust towards the US healthcare system, which has in turn influenced healthcare seeking behaviors amongst the Black community. Within this research project, I attempt to explore the effects these attitudes and experiences have on healthcare seeking behaviors, specifically how both distrust for the healthcare system and lack of access contribute to COVID-19 vaccination trends in the Black community. So a little of my methodology. So because we are currently in a global pandemic, I had to adapt my methodology to accommodate the current circumstances. I heavily relied on virtual platforms like Google Forms, Zoom, GroupMe, and even Twitter to achieve my data collection. To gauge provider perspectives, I conducted an interview via Zoom with a community healthcare provider by the name of Criteria Stafford to assess their experience with vaccinating members of the community. I originally planned 2 interviews, but because of COVID, a provider had to unfortunately cancel their interview. And to gauge community perspectives, I administered a 12-item questionnaire via Google Forms to members of the Black community at UCLA and across California to assess their specific attitudes towards healthcare, their views on the COVID-19 vaccine, and the accessibility of the vaccine itself. And participants were required to meet 2 criteria before participating in the questionnaire, and that was be over the age of 18 and identify as Black. And because of my use of virtual platforms, I had a really strong turnout and I received 92 responses. So a little bit on to like what I was able to find via my data collection. So I am going to spend this time just specifically focusing on the community perspectives instead of the provider perspectives. So when asked whether they received the vaccine, 45.7% of participants said that they were fully vaccinated, and 12% said that they had received their first dose, while 42.3% responded no. And I found that interesting because like media has portrayed that the COVID-19 vaccination trends in the Black community are lower because Black people do not want to be vaccinated, when that's simply not true. Because as you can see, there are people who are actually open to being vaccinated. And when asked whether they think the vaccine is safe, 44.6% of participants responded yes, 40.2% responded I honestly don't know, and 15.2% responded no. And after closer analysis, I found that all of the participants who received the vaccine responded yes or I honestly don't know. And I found this interesting because despite being unsure of the vaccine, those participants still felt the need to help mitigate the possible spread of the virus by being vaccinated. And participants who did not receive the vaccine were asked to choose an option or provide an answer that best described why they haven't been vaccinated. And 23.9% of participants answered, I have not received the vaccine due to mistrust for the US healthcare system. And I found the first stat particularly insightful because it does emphasize a sense of distrust the Black community generally has for the US healthcare system, showcasing a need to bridge that gap. So on to some more key findings. So when asked to rate the accessibility of the vaccine on a scale of 1 to 5, 33.3% rated it a 4 and 26.1% rated it a 5. And I guess it's safe to say that based on this data that the COVID-19 vaccine has been surprisingly accessible to the Black community as a whole, whereas like the media has also portrayed like accessibility in general historically, healthcare has been inaccessible to communities of color like the Black community. So it's surprising to see that they rated the accessibility of the COVID-19 vaccine specifically to be pretty accessible. And in regards to whether they trust their scale, how much they trust the US healthcare system prior to COVID versus after the onset of COVID. If you take a look at the double bar graph on the right, you'll see the general distrust for the US healthcare system increases after the onset of COVID, as participants reported lower ratings of trust after the onset of the pandemic. This is very important because while vaccines have been deemed pretty accessible according to the data, as you can see on the bar graph to the left, Black people still do not trust the system to deliver equitable healthcare, especially given how many Black and brown lives that have been lost due to COVID thus far. So onto my conclusion, the findings in this project showcase relevant and timely information regarding changing the scope of healthcare delivery in communities of color, specifically with the COVID-19 vaccine. The Black community's general distrust for the healthcare system exacerbates their experiences with inaccessible healthcare, meaning the distrust held for the healthcare system heightens the current healthcare disparities experienced by the Black community. This research ultimately exposes the need to develop the necessary resources and strategies to implicate policy to begin trust building so communities of color like the Black community can seek life-saving treatments like the COVID-19 vaccine. So here are some of my sources and a few of my acknowledgements. I would like to extend a special thanks to my faculty mentor who helped me solidify my love for public health research. I'd like to thank my mom and my best friend, Ardam Palmer, for their continued support and love for like listening to me talk about my passion, which is my research. And most importantly, thank you to my community. There's nothing I would change in the world about being a Black woman from Los Angeles. So I'm gonna stop sharing and thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Jailah. That was fascinating. Okay, I've got so many questions for you all, but we're going to go ahead and move into the kind of my directed questions section. And then just as a reminder to those of you who are in the audience, if you have any questions, we'll definitely have time for that at the end of our sort of more directed questions. So you can go ahead and put those in the chat if you've got any questions now. So my first question, I shared these questions with you all before. I think we all probably have a good idea of how the pandemic has affected your project, but I'm curious, actually, maybe I'll keep that open. Is there any of you who wants to expand on that a little bit? Like, how did the pandemic affect the way you went going about doing your project? From obviously, some of your research questions were inspired by the pandemic, but I'm wondering if it shaped just the sort of ins and outs of how you do research. Anyone want to volunteer to start for us? You can just go ahead and start talking.
Yeah, I definitely want to say that my research wasn't possible without the pandemic, examining how the CTRC responded to it in the first place. But I consider myself to be a very hands-on individual. So especially in terms of research, kind of just showing up to a lab or meeting with people face to face and trying to just understand the entire situation before I start trying to nitpick and, get somewhere with my research. But that wasn't possible at all with the CTRC because they had very strict requirements of who could come in. And even as a fully vaccinated individual, I wasn't allowed to enter. So that resulted in me really having to use Zoom and FaceTime and email and kind of this segmented system to try and just get people for about like 20 minutes to interview them, and then, kind of assemble all the pieces myself. So instead of working from a top-down approach, I would say I had to go bottom up.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Anyone else want to share their experiences?
I can, because I'm kind of coming from a different place than Alec. Sorry. Okay. So basically, as you guys saw, we use a mouse model in our lab. So when school transitioned online, I couldn't learn a lot of the experimental techniques or continue experiments that I planned. But there ended up being some use to it because I was able to do literature searches and even contribute to a literature review that was just accepted in Endocrinology, this one journal. It really deterred my project because when we had all these mice bred for experiments last summer, we had to unfortunately sacrifice some of the mice, and we had to rebreed and kind of work with the changes that came about from that.
Thank you. Jailah or Brendan, anything you want to share?
I would have to say that COVID specifically, the pandemic hasn't been the greatest. It presented challenges for me when conducting my data collection with the providers, although I didn't include those results in this presentation. They are in my main presentation going on this week that I had recorded, but it was difficult because one of them did have to, because of the scope of their work and how closely they work with COVID, scheduling was very wonky. One of them had to cancel their interview because of the scheduling issue and having to work the front lines and vaccinating folks and actually providing care. So while I understood that, it did suck in a sense because I definitely wanted their perspective, but when gauging the community perspective, it was a lot easier because I was able to reach far more folks. The accessibility of filling out a Google form rather than setting up a phone interview or a time to speak to someone face to face was a lot simpler, I feel, or convenient, I can say.
Thank you. Brendan, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, for me, I think I would have definitely preferred interviewing all these spaces in person. I think using Zoom made it a little easier, but also you don't get the same feel for the space when you're not there. And so I think that was important to my research. And it's something that I'd actually like to expand upon in the future as, vaccination rates go up and hopefully California keeps moving along.
Thank you. Okay, so my next question, and some of you have addressed this already, but what was the one biggest challenge for you while doing your research in the pandemic? Let's see, Brendan, you want to start us off sometime? this time?
Sure. I think for me, I didn't get to access some of the spaces that I wanted to interview the most because I had to basically do a cold email or cold call. And I think maybe if it weren't for the pandemic, I don't know, it might have been easier to get in touch. I'm not really sure, but some of the spaces that I cited in like my literature review, I didn't get to get in touch with because I didn't have a previous connection. So basically only spaces that I had some kind of connection to already were reachable.
Mhm. Thank you. Okay, Jailah, what was your biggest challenge?
I had touched on it a little bit before. It was mainly scheduling the interviews with the providers. And another thing that I had to kind of just settle for was the fact that I could not incorporate ethnographic methods in my methodology because that's something I really do enjoy doing. And I had plans on visiting the one of the vaccination sites of the community healthcare providers in which they work at to kind of get a greater understanding of what they do, the type of work that they do, resources they provide, and all of that stuff, as well as the ins and outs of running a vaccination center. But with COVID, I wasn't able to do that. So that was a challenge of mine. And I had to strictly rely on interview data, which can get a little boring. So yeah, that was my biggest challenge.
Thank you. Alexia, what about you? Was your challenge the mice?
Actually, no. Mine was like, that was obviously one, not the biggest. I think the biggest was finding the same level of guidance and mentorship that I had from when I was previously working in the lab to like when we transitioned because of COVID. And, I really learned about the importance of like teamwork and communication. So while doing research is always kind of collaborative, I was working in a much more isolated way. And I was actually the only undergraduate who was physically in the lab. So it was kind of difficult to reach out to other members if I had questions or if I didn't know what a specific reagent was, et cetera. But, we started transitioning to actually use Slack a lot more for essential communication. And, unexpectedly, I got to learn a lot more about other projects in my lab and other people like through the use of Slack. So yeah, I got really lucky that I was like able to be trained, but still like finding the same guidance was kind of hard, especially at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. Alec, do you want to share your biggest challenge?
It was definitely making sure, it was kind of similar to Jailah's, trying to pin down everyone because all of the PIs and doctors and nurses and administrative directors at the CTRC were incredibly busy dealing with the pandemic. And, I kind of had to gently email them and be like, hey, could I borrow about half an hour of your time? I have a bunch of questions. And then what I quickly realized is that in these interviews, they would start evolving into something completely unexpected, and I would just have to go off on a tangent and just work with it because there would be this one aspect that, for instance, the UCLA Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Arash Naeem, would start talking about, and I would say, like, I never really thought of that. Could you please tell me more? And that would somehow find its way into my presentation. So it was really just going with the flow.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, my next question for all of you, and I should say now, it's okay if the answer to this question is no, but I was wondering if there was, if you found any silver linings to doing your research in this particular environment. Alexia, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think I have definitely found silver linings because, as I was speaking, like it was a very different environment all around in the lab, but I was able to learn about all the different projects going on in the lab, not just focus on my own. And, learning in that kind of environment helped me pursue like feeling comfortable when I was fully independent. And in research, there's a lot of trial and error, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, and it's really nerve-wracking when you're an undergraduate and you have to do important things and then you don't feel comfortable doing it for the first time. But, I think that all the circumstances led me to be a better researcher now and in the future.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad to hear that. Jailah, what about you? Any silver linings to the experience?
Honestly, I would have to say the biggest thing would have been feeling as though I debunked a media myth. Seeing conversations regarding the vaccination trends and being active on social media platforms and seeing the misinformation, you do start to believe a lot of it. And given I am only limited to my experience with my specific community. I don't know the entire Black community. That's all I saw was the fact that, like, you know, there weren't too many people who were agreeing with being vaccinated. So learning that what I have been seeing isn't necessarily true was definitely a silver lining for me. And I can't wait to expand more on this research so that I can continue to debunk media myths regarding US healthcare in turn, like specifically regarding the Black community and access to care.
Thank you so much. Brendan, what about you? Any silver linings to this experience?
Yeah, and I think part of it is with the pandemic kind of waning. Junior high, Los Angeles, which used to be in East Hollywood, reopened in Glendale just last week, and I got to visit twice already. Los Angeles Poverty Department had their first performance since the pandemic in person, and I got invited to that, and it was really intimate performance at the Mocha Geffen in Little Tokyo. And so it's just like basically things being able to reopen in small capacities, and being able to experience these art spaces and these events in person again is really special for me.
Thank you. Yeah, I went to my first museum last week and I almost cried. It was very emotional. Alec, what about you? Do you have any silver linings to your pandemic research experience?
Sure. I mentioned in the first question how I had to kind of switch from a top-down to a bottom-up approach. And definitely that taught me critical thinking and investigative skills, because I was tasked with kind of finding a credible and kind of tangible research project to pursue involving this massive clinical research organization and structure. And, you know, I had to come through a bunch of different angles looking at, okay, how much data do I want to have in this presentation? Is that data even accessible? Who do I have to talk to? Who do I have to talk to someone that I need information from? And, you know, kind of networking that web of people and information was really, really helpful in just contextualizing the research process.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing your answers to that. Okay, so my last question for you all is, what is the most valuable lesson you have learned this year? And that could be a lesson very much related to the results of your research, or it could be something more personal. Let's see. Jailah, why don't you start us off this time?
My most valuable lesson, I think, I learned within myself. It didn't necessarily have to do with my research, although I came up on some really great findings. This research project really solidified, like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Knowing that I was able to give a voice to a community that is often not heard was very, very, I enjoyed it. I don't even know how to really describe the experience outside of, like, receiving the feedback from some of the participants saying, like, I've never been asked these questions. No one has ever asked me how I felt about receiving healthcare or how it could possibly be changed or anything like that. So, like, it really solidified my future in research and me feeling as though this is something I could do for the rest of my life.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Brendan, what about you?
I think for me, somewhat related to research, but just consistency is key. I've been trying to develop habits over the past year and couple months. And so I've been able to develop, like, writing and meditating habits, and creating art is something that just the past week I've been trying to do every day. And so related to research, it's just, you know, getting those, I guess from the start, it's like doing your research proposal and then getting the emails out to all these spaces, interviewing them, analysis, just keep going with everything. Consistency is so important.
Thank you. Alec, do you want to share with us, what a valuable lesson that you learned this year?
Sure. If you had told me a year ago when the pandemic had first started that I would, one, have a research poster, and two, be presenting it at a panel during Undergraduate Research Week, I probably would have laughed at you, because I really didn't see anything coming out of the pandemic besides me staying in my bedroom all day. But, I was just incredibly surprised and grateful to all of my mentors to kind of offer me this opportunity and show me that, these opportunities are possible if you know where to find them and how to pursue them. And it's not always, especially in STEM, research doesn't always have to be in a lab. Those are really important things, but there's so many other different avenues that you can explore that don't require your presence in a specific place, much like Alexia showed us.
Great, thank you so much for sharing, Alec. Okay, last but not least, we have Alexia.
Yeah, and I don't know how many people watching this have participated in undergraduate research who's interested. But I think one of the biggest things that you learn as a researcher, but especially during this whole COVID time, is just you have to be resilient and you have to be adaptable, and that's kind of like when you do different lab techniques and something goes wrong, you can't just give up and stop there. You have to kind of work around ways, find different avenues to test different things. And my lab work couldn't transition online in the same way. I couldn't really collect data, but there was a lot of other greater understanding of the different projects I've been involved in, greater understanding of my project because I was kind of looking at things through this online format. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just so grateful for this experience because at the end of the day, it kind of shows you how to be confident as a researcher, as an undergraduate.
My heart feels so warm hearing all of the stories of the things that you've learned this year. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. We do have about 10 minutes left. I've asked all of my questions of the researchers, but if any of you have your own questions that you'd like to ask from the audience, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I should be able to call on you. If you raise your hand, I should say, through Zoom, because I can't see all your faces right now. But I'll go ahead and pause myself for a second and you can formulate your questions. And I should also say, if any of the researchers have questions for each other, you can go ahead and ask those too. You can just unmute yourselves.
Brendan, I have a quick question for you. What kind of led you to pursue looking at two different spaces outside of LA? How did you kind of get there?
I think my focus was always kind of United States and not Los Angeles. And slowly, as the emails started going out, I realized I have connections here in LA, and that's kind of easier, to get to. As I mentioned before, 2 or 3 spaces didn't get back to me by email. One of which was ABC No Rio, which was very central to my literature review in New York City. And the other was the Rebuild Foundation in Chicago. And because I couldn't get out to them, I added a couple of spaces in LA to kind of compensate for that. And then I think the 2 spaces outside of LA were also kind of added somewhere in the middle of my research. And so Public Space One, I had a connection to because I contributed to one of their crowdfunding campaigns. And then Meow Wolf, I reached out to their union email because I was very interested in seeing, the perspective of a worker that's working at kind of Meow Wolf is much bigger than a lot of these other spaces because what I learned from my research is that they have this kind of corporate backing now, and they're like multi-million-dollar company now. And so hearing the workers' perspective on that was very important to me.
Okay, so it looks like we've got a question from Whitney Arnold. And so she has kind of a super broad question for you, Brett. And she says, we know the importance of art in general, but can you talk a bit about the importance or role of art during the pandemic specifically? So why does art matter, or why and how has art mattered in the past year?
I think art has been so important in the past year for many reasons, but part of it is just keeping people kind of sane. I think a lot of people rely on art, whether it's making it or viewing it, in order to feel okay about themselves, in order to cope and understand what's going on in their lives. And I think these art spaces have really kind of attested to that. With Naval, they continued their assemblies program online, which is a program where basically they ask the community to come in with their own programming, which I believe is for 10 weeks. And everyone proposes in like 3 minutes. And then basically everyone on that panel and people in Naval and other community members decide on which assemblies are going to get kind of Naval support and some money and funding and a dedicated person to answer all your questions. And so, yeah, when they did it for fall 2020, the focus was very much Black Lives Matter and Black Trans Lives Matter. And, you know, some of it was on like queer futurism and stuff like that, and understanding, yeah, just very like intellectual and academic programs on like BIPOC and queer communities.
Thank you for sharing. We've got another question from the chat from Juliet Lerner. So Juliet asked, what was the most difficult or challenging aspect of conducting your own independent research? So I think we talked about some challenges in general with the pandemic, but what are the big challenges of, being an undergraduate, kind of embarking on your own research project for the first time? Or I know for some of you, this was not your first research or creative project, but what are the big challenges of doing this kind of independent work as an undergraduate?
With this being my first research project, it was definitely just finding out where to start, because I had a variety of different research questions, and I think I probably presented 10 to my mentor, and we just started chopping them down and saying like, okay, what's feasible to conduct in a COVID-19 related environment? What's really accessible here? And, kind of finding the silver lining, like we said, and just kind of going from there. But yeah, definitely where to start.
Great. Thanks, Jailah. It looks like you wanted to chime in.
I did. I would have to say the most difficult or challenging aspect of conducting this specific project was the fact that I'm a senior and I'm also doing like an SRP, and this is completely separate from my SRP. And then also working on this like a research team itself, because I work with ISAP, which works with like substance abuse research on UCLA's campus and stuff like that. It was just a lot going on, and I feel like that was the most challenging, was dedicating the time to my specific project because I was working on other people's projects. So I would have to say that was mine.
Yeah, and I think for me, it was mainly an issue of confidence. Especially when you kind of work in the field that I do, it's like you mess something up, you mess up all the reagents, you waste a whole day of research, and it's kind of like it feels like the stakes are really high, even though I don't think it should, because I think research is just like a learning experience. So I feel like the biggest thing you have to keep in mind when you're doing research is like you're learning, you're researching, and like be confident in yourself because you got yourself to that point. No one else got you there,
Absolutely. Brendan, do you want to jump in there? Or if not, we've got another question. Okay, go ahead.
I just think basically like support is something that I really valued, and without this support, I don't know if it's directly answering the question, but without the support of like Arts Initiative and my faculty mentor and just like figuring out what I was going to do with other people, I wouldn't have been able to do this project. And so I think like the part of your question where it's like independent, like you need people to rely on if this is your first kind of research project.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, we've got one more question, which I think is actually a great question to end on that I will ask each of you. And so the question is from Emma Raffman, and what Emma wants to know, or what Emma says is, what do you see as the greatest future implications for each of your research? So, for example, how to address the Black community in future health crises, possible therapies for obesity during menopause, etc. So where do you see your research going, or what are the implications of your project? That's a big question. So I will let one of you talk when you're ready, instead of calling on you.
I could start. I've actually thought about this because during my literature review, I noticed that there wasn't quite a lot of literature regarding COVID-19 vaccination trends in the Black community. And it could be because the vaccination rollout has been fairly new, but I do feel like my research presents some form of literature for future research projects, because it does show that not only do I explore vaccination trends, I also explore the factors that have affected vaccination trends as well, which is often not talked about. A lot of times you see lack of access or inaccessible healthcare and distrust for the healthcare system explored as two different phenomenons instead of being in conversation with one another. And being that I put them in conversation with one another, I do showcase the layered relationship between the Black community and the US healthcare system. So I hope that my research specifically offers a basis or some type of guide for future research by other people who decide to explore the topic.
Thank you.
I
Brendan?
think, I think for me, something that really excited me about my research from the start, and that I consider a future implication that makes me want to continue the research, is like making a case for the funding for alternative art spaces, making a case so that, you know, I don't know what it would be, maybe the National Endowment for the Arts, or more locally with Los Angeles or California, but just making a case that these spaces deserve more money, more grant opportunities, and things like that.
Thank you. Alec, do you want to go?
Sure. Kind of a future aspect of my research that I'd like to pursue is determining the efficacy of all of the CTRC's different implementations. So looking at like how many people at the CTRC, including employees and healthcare providers, got COVID, even after doing all these different things. And after I examine that efficacy, kind of drafting a list of what clinical research centers across the country can do in the next pandemic or in the next epidemic, and kind of bracing themselves and making sure that they have a plan so that the response isn't as arduous and chaotic.
Great. Thank you. Alexia?
Yeah, and I think for me, so the research I do is in a very like kind of unclear, undefined space. There's a lot of conflicting research. So even like being able to generate a finding and kind of know that like, yeah, I found that out and like I discovered that. That's like a great feeling. But I didn't talk about this too much in my presentation because it was shortened, but just to touch on like the future. So basically hormone replacement therapy, a lot of people have hormone replacement therapy with estrogen, and there can be a lot of side effects of, administering estrogen because of how many areas it like mediates in your body. So the eventual goal would hopefully be to like design a drug or something to have the beneficial effects that estrogen has in certain areas, and then like mitigate some of the side effects that people experience from that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's just 2 p.m. now, so I want to wrap up. I just want to say to our panelists, if you could just stick around after the meeting ends, just for like 2 minutes, that would be fantastic. But I want to thank everyone so much for coming today, and I want to thank you, Alexia, Brendan, Alec, and Jailah, for sharing your research and your experiences. It's been so wonderful to hear about all that you've been able to accomplish in this really kind of crazy year. So congratulations to you all. If everyone could give our panelists a big round of virtual applause, that would be wonderful. And yeah, that's about it. So let me just, for those of you who don't know, this panel is part of a whole week-long series of events at Undergraduate Research Week. And so I encourage you to check out video presentations, which are available on our website all week long. And we have live presentations all day or all afternoon tomorrow. So it's all on our website and you know where that is. So thank you again, everyone, for coming, and have a nice rest of your day.